others are getting more credit for it than that, is going to give unconditional love to all of us, to the sons of any kind like that. And that means, yes, that Jesus is going to, or Jesus or God is going to speak to us directly, and at some level, evidence is not needed. Now, as I said, I don't mean that means evidence is relevant. I think it's not only possible, but incumbent upon the Christian, and not just the philosopher, to say, okay, now what does this mean to me? What does it, I mean, for instance, I should love my brother as myself. What does this mean exactly? Does this mean, for instance, I should never take up arms? And of course, as you know, some, like the Quakers, say yes, and others, like the Anglicans, say no, it's legitimate to do this. Some, like the Mennonites or the Jehovah's Witnesses, would say we're not going to participate in war at all. Others, like the Quakers, would say, no, we're not prepared to fight, but we are prepared to join the ambulance, for instance, which is certainly helping the military effort in some sort of way. I think that all of these are matters of reason, not just faith. You've got to think these things through. And what would it mean to say, I'm following Jesus and loving my neighbour, if, for instance, I become an ambulance attendant in the First World War and go into the trenches on the Battle of the Somme, bringing back wounded soldiers? Am I loving my brother as myself, or is this at some level compromising? Because maybe I'm bringing back soldiers who will be repaired and sent back to fight. Now, I think these are all issues for reason. So I'm not denying reason. Just with John Henry Newman, do we see design? What about design flaws? What about problems to do with evil? These things. So I think there's huge amounts of space for reason and for thought and those sorts of things. But at some level, you want to call me a fideist or whatever, I want to say that faith is absolutely basic. And as it should be. It's not, folks, it's not kind of made up. It's right at the heart of your religion. That God creator, and we're made in his image. We have a special relationship there. So I would want to say, yes, at some level, faith is absolutely central to the Christian religion. And that's not, at some very deep level, an evidential matter.
Okay, so I don't think we disagree about the point that you made just before that last statement. I think you're right in saying, and representing Christianity as saying, that faith is basic. It's fundamental, it's central, that's for sure. But it's not clear that displaces the role that evidence plays in grounding faith. So, for example, my faith might target a different object than it does in the case of Christianity, where my faith might be in some other supernatural being or in a theory, something abstract. I could have faith in lots of different contexts, but the question arises, why faith in this thing? Why faith in God and not something else? Or why no faith at all? And I think that question deserves an answer referencing evidence, that it's relative to evidence that it makes sense to exercise faith in this way rather than another. So the basicality and the centrality of faith isn't diminished by the important role that evidence plays in grounding the faith. In fact, I would correct the record. You said that Paul thought that we couldn't know. You quoted 1 Corinthians 13, I think. And I think that Paul would be very surprised to hear someone say that because of how much emphasis he placed on the value of evidence and the possibility of having knowledge. Now, there are some things we don't know thoroughly and completely. We do see through a glass darkly, but we see. And what we see is not as focused as it would be if the glass was less dark. Another feature of your presentation characterizing Christianity struck me as a little odd because you refer to Thomas, right, and his encounter with Jesus. Now, Thomas had evidence even before he saw Jesus. He had testimonial evidence from his fellow disciples. You know, he was out of the room when Jesus showed up, and when he came and was speaking with them, they said, "Oh, you missed a great opportunity here. Jesus was here. We talked with him. He's alive." And Thomas said, "I'm not going to believe it myself until I can put my fingers in his flesh wounds. Then I'll believe." Well, he had his opportunity, and Jesus held out his hands, and Thomas decided then and there that Jesus was alive without actually exercising the act that he said was required. He didn't put his fingers in the wounds of Jesus. He just spontaneously, instantaneously knelt and said, "My Lord and my God." Now, he had evidence. He had evidence, and when Jesus said what he said, I wrote down what you said Jesus said, and it doesn't quite fit the facts. He doesn't say, "Blessed are those who believe on faith without evidence." So I think that what Jesus was saying is, others will have to believe on the basis of testimony. The evidence they have will be of a different sort. So I guess my question with that as background would be, is this a fair characterization of the Christian point of view, that faith operates independently of the value that evidence plays in grounding that faith?
Well, of course, going back to the beginning of what you said, the snide remark is that I wouldn't take St. Paul as an absolute gospel leading me into understanding the Christian religion, because it seems to me that St. Paul added on a great deal, which I would prefer not to include in the Christian corpus, as it were, starting with substitutionary atonement. But, so leave St. Paul, I focus on Jesus. I don't want to say you're being a bit insincere here, but if Travis came in and said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, but I was crucified this afternoon. I've come, not..." I said, you were what? And he says, "Yes, look at my hands." He pulls off his gloves. I don't think I'm going to have to put my finger in the holes to go along with something dramatic happen. I think Thomas was given evidence. And that's the whole point. Why does Jesus then turn round and say, "But you believe when you got the evidence, better not to do it in the first place"? And so, as I say, I see that as something very important. Now, I think, though, at some point you started to get into something which I found particularly interesting and which I've wrestled with, is what about somebody like myself who does not have faith? How am I supposed to regard somebody like you who does have faith? Should I say, "Ah, yes, you're right, I'm missing something"? And of course, as you know, the answer which we're given is because at some level I'm tainted with original sin in a way that you are not. I'm not saying you're not tainted with original sin, but the position is that failure to have faith is a matter of original sin. Am I supposed to say that? Or am I supposed to say, "No, I think these guys are deluding themselves. They're scared of dying, all of these sorts of things. They like the status." I mean, I'm not saying you're not sincere, but at some level, there's a lot of sincere people who are wrong, as it were. People who are absolutely sincere about something, and then turns out not to be the case. I'm going to win the lottery. I know I am. Well, and so here, the question for me, it's a little one-sided in a way. For you, having got faith, as I say, I think that is self-justifying. I don't think you can need further justification because you've got it. But what about somebody like myself who does not have faith? Am I supposed, therefore, to stand back and say, "I'm missing something, I'm blind in a way that you're not"? Or am I allowed to say, "No, I think you're deluding yourself in a way that I'm not"? And I think you touched on it, but certainly something which is very important for me is the fact that different people have different faith experiences. And let's take those wretched people who were killed in the mosque in New Zealand, in Christchurch, earlier this week. There were 50 people all absolutely convinced, I take it, all convinced that their God, Allah, existed and held them in his heart, or whatever it is. Now, you, as a Christian, have to say, at some level, no, these people were deluded. They did not accept Jesus as their Savior. They think Jesus is a great prophet. I kind of find myself worrying about that. It's not only that I don't have faith, but now different people have different faiths. Both of them are convinced that they're right. And I start to say, it seems to me more plausible to think that you're both deluding yourself. So in a funny sort of way, I think I'm allowed to use natural theology in a way that is precluded for you.
Well, I'm allowed to say that I wouldn't say that about them. I wouldn't say they were deluded, Michael, and I think it's a miscasting of Christianity to lump Christians into that category, who would say that anybody who believes differently is necessarily deluded. In a way, I'm not sure what you mean by that. Do you mean that they're irrational? Do you mean that they are believing without evidence? I mean, if all it means to believe on faith is to believe despite the absence of evidence, then on what basis could you say that anybody was deluded? Right? I think it seems to me that that depends upon whether or not they're weighing evidence correctly. So the Christian, I mean, that implies, you're projecting onto me the view that I would consider these Muslim worshipers deluded. It projects onto me the view that evidence matters to me. But you've denied that it should. So I don't see the consistency there. I don't see how that can be an actually consistent claim. You're making one claim that evidence doesn't play the role that I say it does, and on the other hand, it must play that role in order for me to be justified at all, or to think I'm justified in saying that so-and-so is deluded.
So, let me get this right. Are you prepared to say that a Muslim who denies the divinity of Jesus, does not think that Jesus was the Son of God, does not believe that, as St. Paul tells us, that the way to salvation is through Jesus and Jesus alone? Do you think that the Muslim is okay? Or do you think that the Muslim is not okay? Do you think that the Muslim is sufficiently not okay as to be beyond the pall? In other words, out of the group, just like I am? Or do you want to say, no, I think the Muslim is... of course a Christian is going to say we're all children of God. But the Christian is going to say, in some way, original sin prevents the Muslim from accepting Jesus as his Savior. Now, do you want to say that or not?
Well, what I want to say is that we exercise a certain measure of freedom with respect to what we believe vis-a-vis God. And that God provides us with evidence and does not coerce us by the evidence to believe or not to believe. And we can be responsive to that evidence or not. It can seem to the person that denies that the evidence implies the existence of God is being reasonable. I think a person can be reasonable and deny that God exists. But I think that's because it's reasonable relative to the evidence they have, not to all the evidence that's ultimately available. So for you, for example, there, I think, may well be evidence that has nothing to do with natural theology, nothing to do with arguments, but it's a direct kind of evidence, a perceptual kind of, it's an analog to perceptual experience, where you do experience God in some way. And then you have access to evidence that actually is incriminating on a deeper level than just rationality. It's incriminating on a moral level. And it's not something that allows me to be the judge of someone else, right? That's not the point. The real point there is just that no evidence is going to coerce belief on my part, and so I respect anybody who believes differently. unless it's evidence that I welcome by means of a mechanism that God himself has put in place. So let's suppose that God is absolutely morally perfect and worthy of worship. This is the sort of being that God is. And set aside questions about whether that corresponds to Jehovah or the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jesus, Paul, or whomever. Set aside whether that is Allah or whomever. But this is the being who is most worthy of our worship because he is absolutely morally perfect. All right? Now, a being like that might not really care whether you believe in him. That might sound shocking. If it doesn't go further than just belief that a proposition is true. It may be that a being like that, and I think it isn't true, that a being like that would want something more than just belief that he exists. He would want something like relationship, fellowship, something for which we've been created. Now, this is all conceptual, all theoretical at this point. I haven't given you any evidence or any argument that a being like that exists. I'm saying that if there was a being like that, then it's reasonable to suppose that he would want us to freely engage in relationship with him and fellowship. But for that, we would need evidence. And the evidence would not be the evidence of cosmology or teleology or even a moral argument. And you're right about that, I think. But it would be evidence that was available to us only if we wanted the same thing that God wants. And what God wants is fellowship with himself. If you want that, then I think you will have available to you evidence that differs from all these other evidences. Now, the value that these other evidences can have is that they can give you some reason to believe that God exists, and they can encourage you to investigate further the role that experience can play in confirming the existence of God in the interpersonal way that I've described. But what it really comes down to is whether we do more than just believe that a proposition is true, and whether we're deluded or not relative to the evidence. I don't think that's the question at all. I think the question is whether we would care to have a relationship with a God who is worthy of worship, not demanding of worship, but worthy because he's perfectly good. Now, if we want that, then on my understanding of the implications, then we would have access to evidence that would do that for us, right? So, unfortunately, I think many people who believe in God, whether it's professing Muslim or professing Christian, it could be any one of us in this room, it could be that we're not actually that interested in relationship with God. And so it's not a question of being deluded rationally, it's a question of our moral dispositions towards God as he seeks to bring us into fellowship with him.
I think we're going to run out of time, but what I'd like to suggest is we run straight into my 20 minutes, because I think this is a really important discussion to keep going. Do that. You know, the trouble with you is trouble for me is I thought I was coming to a Baptist college, but I was going to have to fight and argue with good evangelicals, but this chap sounds like a liberal Episcopalian to me. I think I read that as a compliment. You see, here I come back at you. I've got my Muslim in the one corner, and I've got my Christian you in the other corner. And as I see it, you are totally and absolutely committed to Jesus as the Son of God, that there is something special about your religion which highlights the essential truth that God so loved his people that he came down and was prepared to sacrifice himself for our salvation. I mean, it's right there in Paul. One man sinned and another man got us out of the mess. Now, the question is, how am I to deal with my Muslim? I know you don't any more than I want. It's just simply to say the Muslim is a bad person, they don't believe the right thing, they're necessarily going to hell. I'm sure there are Christians, even in this state of Texas, who probably believe exactly that. But I'll give you credit for not believing in that. So now it seems to me you've got two options. I think we were talking a bit about both of them, either at supper or in the car. One is to go the kind of critical theory way, which is to say, at some level, all our knowledge is cultural. And it's therefore almost necessarily the case that, let's say, somebody who grew up in, let's say, 12th century Iran, or whatever it was called in those days, was going to believe one thing, as opposed to somebody like you who grew up in 21st century California. Dear God, that you actually believe in Christianity coming from California. Let's go over that one. Okay, so one way of dealing with this is to say that I think this would have been the position of somebody like John Hick, who would have said there is this essential God, the unknowable, that in an almost Kantian way we have to make sense of within our cultures. And maybe for various reasons our culture is one which is paternalistic or given to the Jews given to sacrifice, these sorts of things. So this is the way our religion is evolved. So at some level it's okay, God's going to put it right at the end. And we have these multiplicity of faiths, but they're all, and of course this is something that I respond to as a Quaker, saying we're all trying to respond in different cultural ways to the unknowable. So that's the one position. The other position, as I see it, is to go back to your evidence and say something like, I think, sincere though the Muslim may be, they are wrong. Now, I have faith, but of course it is now open to me to turn to evidence, and I think this would be William Lyon Craig's third position, that there is evidence to suggest that the resurrection as a literal phenomenon actually existed. I mean, one of the arguments I'm always hearing is that the first people who saw Jesus on the Sunday morning were women. Now, if you wanted people with authority at that time, you would not have used women to be the first to report back on Jesus. So the argument is, this is so absurd, it must be true. Nobody would put this in if they didn't have to. And they have to because it's true. Now, that, I think is another position. It's not one I particularly favour, as you imagine, but at least I can see it's one where you're trying to make some sense of your faith using evidence. Now, how do you respond to those two? Or do you want to say a plague on all of them? That's just not where I'm at.
The Hick view and...
Well, one would be the sort of, the comparative one, which says, to a certain extent, all knowledge is a construction. And where we find us... I mean, let me take, for instance, evolutionary theory. One of the reasons why I'm an evolutionist is because I take the question of origins very seriously. And I think we evolutionists do because we grew up in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which takes origins very seriously, but we're offering a secular answer. Now, had we been Greeks who didn't think in terms of origins in that sort of way, I could well imagine not having evolutionary theory. We wouldn't have creationism, because that's wrong. But we would just conceptualize the world in different... People might say, oh yes, they came from that. But those aren't the really interesting questions. The really interesting questions are homologies or something like that. Origins, but they're not the really interesting questions. What's much more interesting is, do we get cycles, like Plato argues in the Republic? So I'm asking, do you see the possibility, not of making it all totally relative rather, that you can believe what the hell you like and anything goes? Because that's crazy, that's not true. So we're agreed on that, but you could still say there are different ways of conceptualizing the world, and necessarily because we come from different traditions, we're going to conceptualize it differently. But that doesn't mean to say I should give up on what I've got. That's my way of doing it. But it doesn't mean to say at the same time I can't reach out to somebody else and say, let us understand, let us try to agree where we can't agree, let's have tolerance. I mean, tolerance does not extend to female genital mutilation, for instance. But tolerance certainly extends to saying, you don't have to send your kids to Sunday school. You can send your kids to the mosque, or you can go to the synagogue on Saturday. So tolerance goes that far. It doesn't go all the way. But I can see that. Or do you want to say, no, I've in some way got that lean on the truth, but here's where evidence counts. I don't think, let me say, incidentally, I'm not trying to put you in a difficult position, because I think both of these are honourable positions. In a way, I prefer the first, so I'm not trying to label you with something where I can say, you believe that, you're a silly old fool, aren't you? Get back to California.
So I think you need to clarify if you're a liberal Episcopalian. And I think it seems to me the word delusional, figured in, and I wondered if that was, you recoiled from that maybe because that was too strong when it comes to Muslims. And I don't know if that's helpful to sort of bring the conversation together.
I did recoil from that, partly because it's too strong, but also because I think if you understand the concept of being, just the idea of being delusional in terms of recklessly irrational, then I wouldn't want to say that about them. You can be rational and be wrong, right? And you can be wrong for a variety of reasons, and they can have to do with evidence. But I just didn't think it would be right to say, it's certainly not right to say in my case that I would call them delusional. And I don't think that would be a fair representation of the cross-referencing or cross-representation of Christianity either. I'm not sure that Paul would say anything like that. Jesus himself probably would not say something like that. And I'm a disciple of Jesus, right? A proud follower of Jesus Christ. And so I'd want to emulate him. It's certainly not something he would say as far as I can tell. The other part that you wanted to go back to.
Then you had Hick versus William Lane Craig.
Now that's an interesting point. I don't believe in construction. No, I don't think knowledge comes down to constructions in sociological terms or private terms or anything like that. No, I think that to know is Aristotelian, right? To know something to be true is to know it as it is, not as it would be on somebody's view of things. I think that John Hick made some pretty, a kind of a crucial mistake. And I knew John a little bit. We talked quite a bit about this. And, he went from being kind of a conservative, virtually evangelical Christian and moved progressively along this position until he became a very committed sort of pluralist of the sort you described. And I think a mistake that he made was in thinking that you start with religions, right? You start with the great post-axial religions, he called them. The ones that you think of as the great religions of the world. Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, those things. And he said, well, what do they have in common? And it seems like they're all seeking to conceive of something somewhat ethereal, let's call it the real, capital R, and experiencing it, if at all, in unique terms that distinguish them from each other. And so they're all sort of grappling to explain and make sense of the same sort of thing in the context of their own experience. And so he started with kind of a sociology of religious practice at the ground level. I think the mistake is that he did that rather than start with what God might be like at his most excellent status. If God was the excellent being that we think God would be, as morally perfect, right, worthy of worship, then the question is, okay, now what sort of evidence would we have that such a being exists, and what sort of evidence do we have that being the case, if it's reasonable to expect those sorts of things? So you can have a top-down approach where you say, well, if we're talking about the most exalted sort of being there could be, then what sort of evidence would there be? And then we check up on that. Another way to go, though, would be to say, well, now what do we observe going on in the world? What do we observe about the world, about human experience, about all these things that figure into natural theological arguments? How do we explain them? Do they make more sense in light of the possibility of God's existence? So now you've got a bottom-up kind of approach. And I think that you can get a convergence, that you can get evidence from the top-down perspective and the evidence from the bottom-up perspective converging on the same position, that God of a certain sort does exist. And so the ethereal character of the real that you can't really access except through some sort of sociology of my own experience, it doesn't come into play in that way. So I'm just not Hickeyan in that way. So I think that we can get evidence that we can talk about together. So I can say, well, Michael, what do you think about where the universe came from? If it had a beginning, how would you explain it? I mean, that's a good question. Now, we could set aside questions of faith and just talk about that question. And if it turns out that the implications are God exists, well, then we can ask the question, how does that relate to faith? That could be a separate question. But it's not trivial if it points to the existence of God. So we can have that conversation. But if I say to you that in my experience, in the interest of discovering the reality of God, if God exists, I have said in advance, I want to abide by the will of God if he exists, in order to enter into fellowship with God if God exists. Then, if God exists, I think he's going to honor that and provide me with a means of knowing that he's real, because of the way that God interacts with our moral condition, our feelings of guilt and conviction and falling short. And even these experiences can have a supernatural quality about them, right? In a secular context, one might say, well, you're feeling guilty, but it's false guilt. You've done nothing wrong, you shouldn't feel that. Or a person might say, I don't feel guilt in the way that you do. And I might try to describe the phenomenology of my experience of guilt, of conviction, or what have you. And from my point of view, it seems like something else is hounding me than just what you could explain in terms of psychology and sociology. And I think that could be God at work. So that counts as some evidence for God's existence, but partly because God wants to get through to me the need for a morally serious relationship with him, and not just some propositional attitude that God exists.
You see, I think we are really quite separate here.
Yes.
Because I think you want to say, if God exists, then my actions or something are given meaning. And I want to say, because God exists, my actions are given meaning, or at least that's what I think you should believe. Because I don't believe that God exists. So I want to say at some level, in a Sartrean sort of way, that your position is inauthentic. And I don't mean, I mean this purely in a Pickwickian sense, that at some level, I want to say you should make your relationships meaningful whether or not God exists. I don't mean that at some level, I just feel that God shouldn't enter into this. I feel that if I'm going to...
God shouldn't enter into what exactly?
I feel that if I'm going to interact with a student, for instance, and stay late, or, dear God, we all know those students who come to our office 4 times a day, as it were, and say, no, I'm not interested in getting an A, I'm just interested in learning. Well, at some level, what worries me is you put yourself, I'm not saying you personally do it, in the position of saying, well, I'd better stick at this because this will please God, as opposed to saying, this is what my Creator expects of me, and so I'm going to try to live up to his expectations. In other words, I believe in design because I believe in God, rather than that way. Or somebody like myself who says, maybe God exists, maybe God doesn't exist. But an authentic relationship with the student, at some level, doesn't bring God into it. My job is, as a human being, to relate to another human being. Now that makes me sound like a humanist. I'm not very fond of humanism either. At some sort of level, I'm really grasping with where we're at on this. And I'm just worrying about that. How do you see the relationship? We all like nice students, but the job starts when you've got that difficult student, and you're not quite sure whether they're genuinely wanting to learn, whether they're trying to put you on, whether they're trying to impress you, but you know at some level...
This is the Spirit of God at work in your heart right now, those of you who are students, right? Oh my gosh, he's talking about me. You don't want to be thinking that.
No, I'm not. You know perfectly well, as an experienced teacher, how this whole thing works.
Well, maybe we need a distinction between argument and evidence here. Right, a very real distinction between that. Because I think the best evidence we have for many things is evidence that cannot be captured by an argument. So I was walking across campus earlier today, and there were these trees that were budding these beautiful flowers. I don't know what they are. Are they cherry blossoms or something like that? And we don't have a lot of those trees where I live. They're beautiful. People say that about trees that we have too. And I look at that and I see that and I say, that's a tree. And I have the belief it's spontaneous, right, that is a tree. But nobody argues with me. Nobody says, let me tell you why you should think this is a tree. I'm going to give you a good argument for that. No, I just look at it, and the presentation of the object to my consciousness provides me with all the evidence I need. Evidence, right, that I need that is a tree. And so I acquire that judgment. And so it is with God, especially because God is relational and personal. I can encounter God through experience that provides evidence that doesn't require argument. So we need to distinguish between evidence and argument. And so, as I said at the beginning, one kind of evidence that we have could be embedded in an argument, like the evidence of the origin of the universe, of first life, of the emergence of human consciousness. These are all things that a naturalistic theory doesn't really explain very well, very easily. Darwin didn't even pretend to be able to explain how the universe came into existence. His explanations begin after you have organisms. Well, where do they come from originally? So, that's a question, that's a discussion we could have, and I think at the end of the day, at the end of that discussion, I'm going to say, gosh, it seems like God provides us with the hypothesis of God provides us with a pretty good explanation. But I'm not going to settle for hypothesis any more than God would want me to. It's relationship. And that's where relational evidence, interpersonal evidence, can play a really critical role. But here's the thing I don't think we have access to that evidence just automatically. I think we have access to that evidence only if God knows that we want relationship with Him. So it's not a question of whether God demands that we worship Him or God is somehow, because He's transcendent and He's got this will, that He's going to impose it on us. I think His will reflects His desires for us, which would actually be good for us. And so it's not just in God's interest that we come to believe, but it's in our own interest that we can experience that kind of fellowship with the Creator.
Well, in light of the time, why don't we do this? Have the closing remarks, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A from the audience. So, Doug, why don't you go and give your closing remarks?
Oh, closing remarks. Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Do I stay here, or
you can do whatever?
I prefer to sit here.
I think you should stay here now.
Okay. We could trade seats, I could be the atheist for 2 minutes, and how would that go? Look, Michael made reference to a category of evidence or a kind of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus that's just a little snippet. It has to do with the testimony of women concerning the empty tomb and the claim that they had seen Jesus alive in the garden where He was buried. And I think that's very interesting that he might seize on evidence of that sort and say, well, this isn't really the sort of thing you'd want to rely on in believing that Jesus rose from the dead. We are talking in an environment where it matters whether it's God understood by Christians that is real. So let me just close by talking about that for a moment. I believe in the resurrection of Jesus also. I was not present, as Thomas was, in the room to be able to examine the physical evidence firsthand. So my knowledge of the facts historical as they are, depends extensively, but not exclusively, on testimonial evidence handed down through time. Now, it isn't just that Thomas told Betty, and Betty told Sarah, and Sarah told Sam, and Sam told Harriet, and then now here we are in the 21st century, and by this long chain of testimonial evidence, we have it that Jesus rose from the dead. And all I've really got to go on is what Harriet told me, when I was 10 years old or whatever. It's not like that. No, what we have is historical evidence that has been treated by historians using by historical methods and tools to determine what sorts of things did happen, and in fact, what some specific things happened. Now, one of the things that we know is that Jesus' disciples believed that he rose from the dead. We know that. They believed it. Now, that to me is an astonishing fact about them. Because for them to be persuaded that Jesus rose from the dead would require a pretty high standard of evidence, even for first century people, right? These are people who know what it means for somebody to be dead. They don't need, clinical tests or anything like that. He's been in the tomb, right? He expired on the cross. They know these things about him, and they've abandoned hope. But then they have reason to believe, based on eyewitness experience and then more eyewitness testimony from others, that he is alive again. That's pretty good. Their demand for evidence, just implicit in the need to believe. Look, what does it take to be justified in believing in the resurrection? What would it take? And I think for me to believe at that point in time in the resurrection of Jesus would require the same evidence that they had. That's the kind of evidence I would want to have because of the kind of person I am. You say, well, you weren't there, then why do you believe? I think that the evidence that they believed that Jesus rose from the dead, and I would encourage you to write this down. Think about it. The evidence that they believed that Jesus rose from the dead is actually evidence that they knew he rose from the dead. And here's why I think that. First of all, the evidence would have to rise to a certain standard just for them to believe it, because of how incredible it really is. It's a miracle that outstrips miracles. It's an unprecedented event. It's a singularity. Nobody has ever witnessed something like this before, unless you want to talk about the case of Lazarus, which took place under Jesus' direction. He was the miracle worker. So here you have a resurrection. On what basis are you prepared to believe that? You've got to meet a pretty high standard if you're a normal human being. I think these guys were at least normal human beings, right, with average intelligence. Okay? So they're prepared to believe this remarkable fact, if it is, about the historical Jesus. He rose from the dead. So they've got a lot of evidence if they're going to believe that. Beyond that, they recognize the implications of believing that. It's radical. It's transforming. They have to live a different life than they had planned for themselves if they really believe this. So now if your life is going to be turned upside down because of what you believe, then the standard has to go up that much more. So not only does the standard of evidence have to be high in order to be justified in believing such an otherwise incredible thing, but it has to be higher if you're going to actually live on the basis of that claim. Right? So I have evidence that that's what they believed and that their evidence measured up to that standard. This is evidence that they had knowledge, because that means because their evidence would have had to be so strong that it would be tantamount to knowing, believing on that basis. So I have evidence that they know. And this gives me pretty strong evidence for thinking that it's true, and maybe even on that basis alone I could know that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. That's much more controversial, and I'm not prepared to defend that view here just now. Now, why would I throw this in? Two reasons. First of all, Michael brought in the topic of the resurrection himself earlier, and he is talking about Christianity, right, quite a bit. He's had quite a bit to say about it. Second, the fact of the resurrection of Jesus and the supporting evidence for that fact provides us with additional evidence that God does exist. It is part of the evidence for God's existence. Not just because it would take a God to produce a resurrection, to raise Jesus, but because God would have to have a reason to raise Jesus if he's going to do it. So it isn't just evidence that there is a God, it's evidence that God's imprimatur is on Jesus and what Jesus taught. Right? So it's very important to understand that this adds some weight not only to the evidence for the existence of God, but for the truth of Christianity. So those are reasons why I would say that. Now, if Jesus has risen from the dead, then the possibility of interpersonal relationship with God that mediates private religious experience becomes all that much more real. And that's the kind of evidence I'm saying I could have that you don't have unless it's relationship with God through Christ that you would really want.
Well, okay. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll move to Michael's closing remarks, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Well, I suppose I go out as I came in. That, as I've said, I'm pretty atheistic about Christianity. I'm not an atheist about everything, in the sense that there are just things I don't know. I'm not sure I ever will know. My question, though, is facing something like Christianity, is that I don't have faith. The question is, where should I go from there? Should I regret this fact? Should I feel lesser because of this? Should I maybe go to, if not therapy, at least to camps and things where, we're taught how to try to strengthen or to develop faith? I'm sure these exist. Or should I rather say, no, I don't think I want to go that way, because I'm not convinced that that's an end that I necessarily want to end up with. And I think that's pretty much as I feel at the moment. We've talked quite a bit this evening about the problem of different faiths and the problems I have there. What we haven't talked about particularly is the whole problem of evil and how one reconciles the existence of a good God with the evil in the world. I mean, what happened in New Zealand earlier this week, or in the last century, those appalling things like the Holocaust. And I know the Christian answer is that, well, God gave us free will, and one of the consequences of free will is that people are going to do evil things. But that's, as it were, part of the price or the cost of being made in the image of God. If we didn't have freedom, then we wouldn't be free, and then we wouldn't be like God, because at some level, God is obviously, ultimately, totally free. Well, I'm just not convinced that the free will of Heinrich Himmler is more important than the life and death of Anne Frank in Bergen-Belsen in April of 1945. Not just Anne Frank, of course, but the hundreds, thousands, millions of wretches who were shipped out east to the awful concentration camps, the death camps in Poland and elsewhere. So as I say, as somebody outside, I think I am allowed to appeal to evidence, because I don't have faith, and therefore what can I use but evidence? And so as I say, I feel very strongly that it's not just that I'm not a Christian, but that I don't particularly want to be a Christian. I think that's where I'm at. Now, that doesn't mean to say that I'm not intensely interested in these issues, or that I don't want to mix with Christians or understand Christianity, because I'm constantly amazed at what a subtle religion and what a careful religion it is. So please don't, I'm not a Richard Dawkins who just thinks these things are just silly and for weak-minded people, because that's not where I'm at. I want to understand the human condition, and understanding religious people is part of it. Obviously, I think there are other aspects, social aspects, and things like this, and when I see, let's say in America, the reluctance of even the best evangelicals to introduce some kind of universal medical care, I say to myself, well, you know, something's wrong with this country, and if Christianity is part of it, then I want to know why, and I want to root that out. So obviously there are political reasons too. But as I say, they're intellectual and they're social reasons. And so let me just end by saying, I do think it's faith rather than evidence as such for the Christians. But I think this is somewhat asymmetrical, that if you don't have faith, then obviously reason and evidence has to be primary, because what else have you got? You've got nothing else. And as I say, my reason, my evidence, leads me to be not only suspicious of Christianity and its claims to be the right religion, but even of its claims to be what it is. And for me, there are just internal inconsistencies with Christianity which make it, as I say, not only something I can't accept, but something I don't very much want to respect.
All right. Well, let's thank our speaker. Let me invite you to the microphones if you have questions you want to ask.